Well, actually, Elvis loved the song. That was when he and Priscilla were having their problems, which I met her recently, and she told me that Elvis loved that song, and he had sung that to her on the day of their divorce.
With more than 100 million records sold, over 3,000 songs written, and a career spanning nearly 6 decades, Dolly Parton's story is already etched into music history. Throughout that amazing career, there are 5 pivotal encounters, spanning from the late 1960s to the 2010s, where power, money, control, and reputation collided. Today, at 79, Dolly Parton has finally named the 5 singers she hated the most. Porter Wagoner mentorship, control, and the cost of independence. In 1967, a 21-year-old Dolly Parton stepped into a national spotlight that would change everything. The stage belonged to Porter Wagoner, already a towering figure in country music, host of The Porter Wagoner Show. When Dolly replaced singer Norma Jean as his new duet partner, the decision wasn't universally welcomed. Audiences had grown attached to the previous lineup, but Wagoner saw something precise and bankable, a distinctive voice, sharp songwriting instincts, and a personality that could command attention. He didn't just offer her a platform, he placed her inside a machine built for national fame. The numbers moved quickly. By the late 1960s, the duo was recording prolifically, releasing multiple singles a year under RCA Victor. Their duets like The Last Thing on My Mind and We'll Get Ahead Someday began climbing the country charts, some reaching the top 10. Touring schedules intensified, often running over 200 dates annually, a relentless circuit of theaters, fairs, and televised performances. Wagoner's brand was unmistakable: rhinestone suits, theatrical flair, and tightly controlled production. And Dolly became part of that spectacle. But even as she sang harmonies beside him, she was writing constantly, building a separate catalog that hinted at a different kind of artist, one less interested in staying in anyone's shadow. By 1971, the shift was measurable. Dolly's solo single, Joshua, hit #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart, her first chart topper as a solo artist. It wasn't an accident or a one-off. Within 2 years, she followed with Jolene and Coat of Many Colors, songs rooted in personal storytelling rather than the polished duet format that defined her work with Wagoner. Jolene, released in 1973, would become one of her most recognizable songs globally, eventually entering the Grammy Hall of Fame. The more her solo career accelerated, the more the imbalance became visible. She was no longer just a featured partner. She was a rising force with independent commercial value. Behind the scenes, the structure that had once elevated her began to tighten. Wagoner, operating in the traditional mold of country music mentorship, believed in a hierarchical system. He discovered her, he shaped her, and therefore he retained authority over her career trajectory. Contracts signed in the late 1960s reflected that mindset, binding Dolly to his show, his touring commitments, and in some cases, his production oversight. But the industry itself was changing. The early 1970s saw artists pushing for greater autonomy. Dolly was paying close attention. She wasn't just writing songs. She was studying publishing rights, royalties, and long-term revenue streams. These were areas where many artists, especially women at the time, had little control. The tension reached a critical point around 1973. Dolly's schedule had become unsustainable, recording solo albums, writing for other artists, filming television appearances, and maintaining her obligations to Wagoner's show. Creatively, she was moving in directions that didn't align with the duet format. Financially, she was beginning to understand the difference between earning as a performer and earning as a songwriter with ownership stakes. She wanted out, but leaving wasn't as simple as walking away. The agreements she had signed years earlier were still binding. In 1974, she made the decision anyway. She delivered the exit through a song, I Will Always Love You. It was written for and performed directly to Wagoner. There was a dual meaning here: gratitude and departure. It would go on to top the country charts twice, first in 1974 and again in 1982. making her the first artist to achieve that feat with the same song. But in that moment, it wasn't a commercial move. It was a calculated, emotional gesture aimed at softening a business rupture. Wagoner understood the message immediately, but understanding did not mean acceptance. The aftermath stretched over years. Dolly moved forward rapidly, signing new deals, expanding her solo catalog, and crossing into mainstream success. By the late 1970s, she was no longer confined to country radio. Her 1977 hit, Here You Come Again, marked a major crossover into pop charts, reaching number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100. Meanwhile, the unresolved contractual issues with Wagoner lingered. In 1979, 5 years after her departure, the conflict escalated into a lawsuit. Wagoner filed a $3 million claim alleging breach of contract, seeking compensation tied to the earnings he believed he was entitled to as her former partner and promoter. $3 million in 1979 was a substantial financial threat, equivalent to well over $10 million today when adjusted for inflation. If Wagoner succeeded, it could reinforce the idea that early career mentorship translated into long-term financial entitlement. For Dolly, the stakes were existential. By then, she had built a growing empire, not only as a performer, but as a songwriter with publishing control. Losing a significant portion of her earnings would undermine the very independence she had fought to secure. The case did not play out in a prolonged public trial. Instead, it was settled privately, with Dolly later confirming in interviews that she paid Wagoner what she felt she owed. The exact terms were never fully disclosed. Both parties then decided to move forward without further legal escalation. Importantly, it preserved her control over her catalog and future earnings. By the early 1980s, she was expanding into film, starring in 9 to 5 in 1980, a box office success that grossed over $100 million worldwide. What followed was a gradual recalibration. By the late 1980s, Dolly and Wagoner began to appear in the same spaces again, speaking more openly and with less tension. She consistently referred to him as a mentor, acknowledging that without his platform, her early trajectory would have been very different. In 2002, the reconciliation reached a symbolic peak when she inducted him into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Standing on that stage, decades after their split, she described him as one of the most colorful characters in country music and credited him with helping launch her career. Their final chapter unfolded quietly. In 2007, Wagoner was hospitalized with lung cancer. Dolly visited him during his final weeks. When he died later that year at the age of 80, she honored him with a tribute concert at Dollywood, her own theme park, in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. By then, Dollywood had become a major tourist destination, drawing over 2 million visitors annually, a testament to her evolution from performer to business magnate. Looking back, Wagoner provided access, infrastructure, and visibility to her at a time when those resources were tightly controlled. But that same structure imposed limits that Dolly ultimately refused to accept. The lawsuit, the settlement, and the years of silence that followed were predictable consequences of a system where mentorship and control were often indistinguishable. The lasting impact of this chapter is measurable in the decisions that followed. Dolly became known for retaining publishing rights, for negotiating contracts with long-term revenue in mind, and for maintaining control over her brand across music, film, and business ventures. Her catalog would eventually include over 3,000 songs, and her net worth would climb into the hundreds of millions. But this would not be the only challenge in her saga. Elvis Presley, the deal she refused and the fortune she kept. In the early 1970s, Dolly Parton was no longer an unknown voice trying to break through. She had already written and recorded Jolene and I Will Always Love You, 2 songs that were beginning to circulate beyond the tight boundaries of country radio. I Will Always Love You, released in March 1974, had already climbed to number 1 on the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart. It was deeply personal, written as a farewell to Porter Wagoner, but its emotional clarity made it universal. That universality is what caught the attention of the biggest star in America. Elvis Presley was more like an institution rather than a star. By the early 1970s, He had sold tens of millions of records, starred in over 30 films, and maintained a Las Vegas residency that drew thousands per night at the International Hotel. When word reached Dolly that Elvis wanted to record her song, it was, in industry terms, a career-defining moment. Presley's recordings routinely turned songs into global hits, crossing genres and reaching audiences that country artists rarely accessed at the time. This was the kind of exposure that could permanently elevate her catalog. The initial excitement was real. Dolly has described in multiple interviews that hearing Elvis wanted her song felt almost surreal. She had grown up listening to him, watching his rise from Sun Records to worldwide fame. The idea that he would take her composition, her words, her melody, and reinterpret it was both an honor and a validation. But in the music industry of the 1970s, admiration rarely moved without negotiation. Before Elvis could enter the studio, the terms had to be set. And those terms were not handled by Elvis himself. They came from Colonel Tom Parker, the man who had controlled nearly every major business decision in Presley's career since the 1950s. Parker's strategy was consistent and well known among industry insiders. If Elvis recorded a song, he often demanded a share of the publishing rights. Publishing was where the real money lived, not just in initial sales, but in long-term royalties from radio play, covers, licensing, and future recordings. Parker's standard demand in many cases was 50%. That meant, if Dolly agreed, she would be giving up half of the ownership of I Will Always Love You in exchange for Elvis's version. The numbers behind that decision were not abstract. At the time, Dolly was still building her financial base. She had hits, but she was not yet the multi-industry powerhouse she would become in the 1980s. Giving up 50% of a song might have seemed like a reasonable trade for immediate exposure, especially when that exposure came from Elvis Presley. But Dolly had already begun to understand something critical. A song was not just a performance, it was an asset. Every time it was played on the radio, pressed onto vinyl, or performed by another artist, it generated income. Over years, even decades, those earnings could compound into millions. The meeting where the terms were presented has been described by Dolly as one of the most difficult moments of her early career. She was told clearly, if Elvis were to record the song, Parker would require half the publishing. There was no negotiation, no middle ground. It was a take-it-or-leave-it offer. For many artists, especially those early in their careers, the answer would have been immediate acceptance. Elvis's version could have turned the song into an international standard overnight. It could have placed Dolly's name in markets she had not yet reached. Instead, she hesitated. You see, by 1974, she had already started to prioritize ownership, a lesson reinforced by her earlier contractual tensions with Porter Wagoner. She knew what it meant to lose control over her work, even partially. Giving up 50% of I Will Always Love You would not just affect that one recording. It would affect every future use of the song. Every cover version, every film placement, every royalty check would be split. The decision she made in that moment would echo for the rest of her life. She said no. Dolly has recounted that she went home and cried that night, fully aware of what she was walking away from. Elvis Presley did not record I Will Always Love You. The opportunity disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. There was no second offer, no renegotiation. In immediate terms, the loss was tangible. Elvis continued recording and performing, and Dolly continued building her career without that potential boost. The song remained a country hit, but it did not achieve the global crossover that an Elvis version might have delivered. For nearly 2 decades, that decision existed as a quiet what if. Dolly's career, however, did not stall. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, she had crossed into pop music with hits like Here You Come Again, starred in films such as 9 to 5, and expanded her reach far beyond country audiences. She also continued to hold full ownership of her songs through. Even when her songs were not topping charts, they were still generating income. Then, in 1992, the equation changed completely. Whitney Houston recorded I Will Always Love You for The Bodyguard, a film starring Houston and Kevin Costner. The song was rearranged dramatically, opening with an a cappella section that highlighted Houston's vocal control before building into a full orchestral climax. Released in November 1992, the track became a global phenomenon. It spent 14 consecutive weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, a record at the time, and topped charts in over 20 countries. The commercial impact was massive. The single sold over 20 million copies worldwide, making it one of the best-selling singles of all time. The Bodyguard soundtrack itself sold more than 45 million copies globally. Every one of those sales, every radio play, every performance generated publishing royalties. And because Dolly had refused Colonel Parker's demand nearly 20 years earlier, she owned 100% of those publishing rights. The financial outcome was staggering. Dolly's earnings from I Will Always Love You rest in the tens of millions of dollars, potentially exceeding $50 million over time when accounting for all uses, including film licensing, international sales, and continued streaming revenue. This next one was subtle, perhaps not even hatred, but still a significant hiccup. Linda Ronstadt. Brilliance, friction, and creative incompatibility. By the early 1980s, Dolly Parton had already crossed the boundary from country star to mainstream force, while Linda Ronstadt had spent the 1970s dominating rock and pop charts with a run of platinum albums, including Heart Like a Wheel and Simple Dreams, both of which produced #1 hits. Their paths had intersected informally through industry circles, but the real convergence point came through a third figure, Emmylou Harris, whose reputation for blending country, folk, and rock made her a natural bridge between the two. What began as a casual idea, 3 distinct voices combining on a single project, slowly evolved into one of the most anticipated collaborations in country and roots music. The origins of Trio trace back to the mid-1970s, when Parton, Ronstadt, and Harris first discussed recording together. Scheduling conflicts delayed the project for nearly a decade. Each artist was operating at peak demand. Ronstadt was releasing albums almost annually, Harris was building a critically acclaimed catalog with Warner Brothers, and Parton was balancing music with film roles like 9 to 5. By the time serious recording sessions began in the mid-1980s, the project carried not just artistic ambition, but also commercial expectations. Warner Brothers Records backed the album, recognizing the combined drawing power of 3 established stars. When Trio was finally released in March 1987, it performed exactly as predicted, strongly and immediately. The album reached #1 on the Billboard Top Country Albums chart and peaked at #6 on the Billboard 200, a significant crossover achievement for a roots-oriented project. It sold over 4 million copies in the United States alone, earning quadruple platinum certification from the RIAA. Singles like To Know Him Is to Love Him and Telling Me Lies charted successfully, with the former reaching #1 on the country chart. Critically, the album was equally well received, winning the Grammy Award for Best Country Performance by a Duo or Group with Vocal in 1988. On the surface, the collaboration looked seamless. 3 voices, each distinct, blending into tight harmonies that drew from Appalachian traditions, bluegrass structures, and 1960s folk influences. But the process behind that sound was far from uniform. Dolly Parton approached recording with speed and instinct. Known for writing thousands of songs, she was comfortable making quick decisions in the studio. Ronstadt, by contrast, treated recording as a technical and iterative process. This difference in approach did not immediately derail Trio, but it did create friction. Studio sessions, often scheduled in Los Angeles and Nashville, stretched longer than initially planned. Ronstadt's insistence on precision meant revisiting tracks repeatedly, while Parton, balancing multiple commitments, including acting, touring, and running business ventures like Dollywood, which opened in 1986 in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, preferred efficiency. Harris often found herself mediating between the two, adapting her own process to maintain cohesion within the group. Despite these internal dynamics, Trio succeeded because the shared goal of producing a high-quality collaborative album remained aligned. The success of the record created immediate demand for a follow-up, informally referred to as Trio 2. Plans for a second album began as early as the late 1980s, with recording sessions taking place intermittently over several years. However, the conditions that had been manageable during the first project began to complicate the second. By the early 1990s, all three artists were navigating different phases of their careers. The delays were not minor. While Trio had taken years to initiate, Trio 2 faced repeated postponements even after recording had begun. Scheduling conflicts intensified. Parton's calendar remained densely packed with recording, touring, and business expansion. Ronstadt, meanwhile, continued to refine her artistic direction, exploring genres beyond country and rock, including traditional Mexican music, with albums like Canciones de mi Padre. Harris maintained a steady output of albums and collaborations, often working with different producers and musicians. Coordinating studio time for all three became increasingly difficult. The friction extended beyond scheduling into creative control. Decisions about track selection, arrangement, and production became points of negotiation. Ronstadt's meticulous approach meant that tracks could remain in development for extended periods, while Parton's preference for momentum created pressure to finalize recordings. These differences were not expressed as public disputes, but they influenced the pace and structure of the project. By the early 1990s, it was clear that Trio 2 would not follow the same trajectory as its predecessor. One of the more contentious developments during this period involved the handling of recorded material. Reports from industry sources indicated that some tracks initially intended for Trio 2 were repurposed by Ronstadt for her 1995 album Feels Like Home. This decision reflected both practical and artistic considerations. Ronstadt had material ready for release, while the collaborative project remained stalled. For Parton, who had contributed vocals and time to those sessions, the move was difficult to reconcile. It reflected the challenge of managing shared ownership in a project where each participant also maintained an independent career. The release timeline illustrates the extent of the delays. While recording for Trio 2 began in the late 1980s, the album was not officially released until 1999, 12 years after the original Trio. By that point, the musical landscape had shifted significantly. Country music in the 1990s had moved toward a more commercial, arena-driven sound, with artists like Garth Brooks and Shania Twain dominating charts. The roots-oriented style of Trio occupied a different space, more aligned with traditional and Americana audiences. When Trio 2 finally arrived, it received positive reviews, but it did not replicate the commercial impact of the first album. The problem here was compatibility. It was a clash of systems rather than personalities. Parton operated on a model of high-volume creativity. Ronstadt operated on a model of refinement. Both approaches were effective within their own contexts, but put together, they failed to synergize. By the late 1990s, the collaboration had effectively run its course. While this was a subtle friction, this next one was much more serious. Howard Stern, media manipulation and reputation risk. In 2008, Dolly Parton was promoting an audiobook version of her memoir, Dolly, My Life and Other Unfinished Business. Audiobooks, at the time, were expanding rapidly as a format. For Parton, whose brand had been built over 4 decades on warmth, humor, and emotional sincerity, narrating her own life story was an extension of her public identity. That same year, Howard Stern, known for pushing boundaries on The Howard Stern Show, turned his attention to that audiobook. By 2008, Stern had already transitioned from terrestrial radio to Sirius XM satellite broadcasting, a move that gave him fewer regulatory constraints and a more niche but highly engaged audience. His show routinely attracted millions of listeners, and its content, often explicit, controversial, and comedic, relied on shock value as much as humor. Within that environment, Parton's carefully crafted narration became raw material for something entirely different. Stern's production team extracted audio clips from Parton's audiobook and reassembled them using editing techniques that, while not technologically advanced by modern standards, were effective enough to alter context. Words and phrases were cut, rearranged, and layered in a way that made it sound as though Parton was saying things she had never actually said. The manipulated segments included statements that appeared racially insensitive and dismissive of other artists. For listeners unfamiliar with the source material, the illusion could be convincing. In 2008, audio editing software like Pro Tools and Adobe Audition had made it possible to splice and recontextualize speech with relative ease. Stern framed the segment as a parody, a long-standing defense in his programming. But the distinction between satire and misrepresentation blurred quickly when the voice in question belonged to someone whose reputation depended heavily on authenticity. The reaction was immediate and, for Parton, deeply personal. She issued a public statement describing herself as shocked, hurt, and embarrassed. There was, briefly, the possibility of legal action. Defamation law in the United States hinges on whether false statements presented as fact cause harm to a person's reputation. In this case, the argument would have centered on whether the manipulated audio constituted a false representation of Parton's views. However, Stern's team could rely on the defense of parody, a protected form of speech under the First Amendment, particularly when presented within a comedic framework. Parton ultimately chose not to pursue a lawsuit. The decision aligned with a pattern that had defined her approach to conflict: minimize escalation, avoid prolonged public disputes, and protect long-term brand integrity over short-term vindication. From a strategic perspective, engaging in a legal battle with Stern would have extended the life of the controversy, drawing more attention to the manipulated content. By stepping back, she limited the incident's visibility. Stern's response followed a predictable line. He characterized the segment as a parody, insisting it was meant to be humorous rather than malicious. On air, he described the bit as absurd and emphasized that it should not be taken seriously. The broader media environment in 2008 played a role in how the incident unfolded. Social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook were still in relatively early stages of adoption, lacking the algorithm-driven amplification that would later define viral controversies. As a result, the spread of the manipulated clips was more contained than it might have been a decade later. Nonetheless, the incident entered entertainment news cycles and remained part of the conversation whenever Stern's more controversial segments were discussed. The incident, however, did not disappear entirely. It lingered in media archives, occasionally resurfacing in retrospectives about Stern's career or discussions of controversial radio moments. For Parton, it became part of a broader pattern of navigating public perception in an evolving media landscape. By 2023, the context had shifted significantly. Parton released Rockstar, a rock-oriented album featuring collaborations with artists across genres, including Paul McCartney, Elton John, and Miley Cyrus. The project marked a deliberate expansion of her musical identity, aligning with her induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2022. Promotion for the album required reaching audiences beyond her traditional base, including platforms that might not have been part of her earlier strategy. That strategy included an appearance on The Howard Stern Show. The decision was notable precisely because of the 2008 incident. 15 years had passed, but the memory of the controversy remained part of the public record. Choosing to appear on Stern's program signaled a calculated move rather than a casual booking. It suggested that Parton was willing to engage with a platform that had previously posed a reputational risk, but on terms that she could manage. The interview itself was markedly different from the earlier incident. Stern adopted a more restrained tone, focusing on Parton's career, songwriting, and the Rockstar album. He referred to her as a legend and avoided provocative framing. Moving on, Jeff Tweedy, criticism in the legacy era. By the 2010s, Dolly Parton had entered the legacy era. She was no longer competing for relevance. With a catalog often estimated at over 3,000 songs, more than 100 million records sold worldwide, and a career spanning 5 decades, her position in music history was largely settled. At the same time, a new generation of songwriters was reshaping how serious songwriting was discussed. One of those voices belonged to Jeff Tweedy, frontman of Wilco, a band widely regarded for its introspective lyrics and experimental approach. Tweedy's reputation was built on a very different model of songwriting. Emerging in the 1990s and 2000s, his work leaned toward ambiguity, layered meaning, and emotional fragmentation. By the time he spoke about Dolly Parton's music in the 2010s, he was seen not just as a performer, but as a writer's writer, someone whose opinions carried weight in discussions about craft and substance. The remarks themselves were not delivered as a direct attack, but they were pointed enough to spark a reaction. Tweedy suggested that Parton's songwriting, while undeniably influential, leaned more toward catchiness than depth. In one widely circulated quote, he implied that after writing Jolene, one of her most famous songs released in 1973, she could have stopped there. The statement was presented as a critique, but it carried an implication that her broader catalog lacked the complexity often associated with critically acclaimed songwriting in alternative and indie circles. The timing of these comments mattered. By the 2010s, Dolly Parton's work had already been canonized in multiple ways. Critiquing her songwriting in this context meant challenging not just individual songs, but a body of work that had demonstrably connected with millions. The reaction to Tweedy's comments was shaped by that scale. Fans and commentators pointed to the emotional clarity of Parton's writing. What made the situation notable was not escalation, but the absence of it. Dolly Parton did not respond publicly. There were no interviews addressing Tweedy's remarks, no social media posts, no indirect references. This silence was consistent with a pattern established over decades. Whether dealing with industry disputes, media controversies, or personal criticism, she chooses not to engage directly. It's simply not worth it. Outro. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.